When she first heard about the exchange program, the alien girl did not believe it was a good idea. Her people always spoke about humans with suspicion and warnings. They were described as reckless explorers, creatures who rushed into danger, without thinking, who laughed in the face of discipline, and who let emotions cloud every decision. In her world, logic and order were considered the highest values. To let emotions guide you was to show weakness, and weakness was never forgiven. Yet, when the call for volunteers to join a human starship as a guest observer was announced, something in her heart pulled her forward. Against her own better judgment, she raised her hand. She told herself she was only doing it to confirm what she already believed, that humans were unpredictable and dangerous. But deep inside, she also carried curiosity. She wanted to see them with her own eyes. When the day finally came, she stood at the docking bay of her home station, her slender form wrapped in the ceremonial robe of her people. Around her, officials whispered quietly, warning her one last time to remain careful. "Do not trust them too easily," one elder told her. "They may appear friendly, but they will always put themselves first." She nodded respectfully, but her mind was already racing with images of what awaited her. She imagined humans stomping about with loud voices, careless laughter, and wild gestures. She thought she would feel disgust. She thought she would feel superior. Yet when the airlock door opened and the human crew appeared to welcome her, she felt only confusion. The humans smiled at her. Their eyes were bright, their hands extended in greeting. The captain, tall and broad-shouldered, bent slightly forward, not in arrogance, but in respect. "Welcome aboard," he said, his voice steady yet warm. She had expected cold efficiency or aggressive dominance. Instead, she was greeted with kindness. It unsettled her. She wanted to keep her guard up, to remain distant, but the warmth of their welcome made her feel strangely noticed, as if she mattered. Walking through the corridors of the human ship for the first time was like stepping into another world. Her people's vessels were silent, with hushed tones and rigid lines. Every step echoed like a command, but the human ship was alive. She heard laughter from one room, music from another, voices calling out to each other across the hall. The walls were not bare and cold like in her home. Instead, she noticed small decorations, personal touches, photographs, little drawings, objects that clearly meant something to the crew. To her people, such things would be distractions, even weaknesses. But here, they seemed to give the ship its own heartbeat. She tried to ignore the sounds, the liveliness, the way humans clapped each other on the shoulders or greeted one another by name. Instead, she focused on studying their structure. Where was the strict chain of command? Why did the lower-ranked crew members laugh so freely around officers? Why did no one bow their head in silent obedience? It was chaos, or at least it should have been. And yet, despite the noise, despite the looseness of their behavior, the ship seemed to run smoothly. Orders were carried out quickly, tasks were done with energy, and no one appeared afraid of speaking. She could not understand how such disorder could create efficiency. On her first evening, she was invited to the mess hall. She wanted to refuse to stay alone in her assigned quarters, but the captain insisted gently. "It's important you see how we live," he told her. "Not just how we work." So she went. The moment she stepped inside, she froze. The hall was filled with chatter, with the clinking of dishes, with bursts of laughter that rolled across the room like waves. Humans were sitting together, eating side by side, some leaning close in conversation, others gesturing wildly with stories. She had never seen such informality. On her ships, meals were silent and efficient. Here, food seemed to be a celebration. She was given a tray and offered different dishes. She stared at the variety, spices, colors, smells she had never experienced. It was overwhelming. Sitting among them, she felt like a shadow, stiff and uncertain, while the humans laughed and teased each other. At first she thought it rude, this constant joking. But as she listened, she realized there was no cruelty in it. They laughed to include, not to exclude. A young officer spilled his drink, and instead of punishment or shame, his friends laughed, and he laughed with them, and soon even the captain chuckled. She sat quietly, watching with growing confusion. In her culture, mistakes brought harsh discipline. Here, mistakes brought laughter and support. That night, when she returned to her quarters, she lay awake for hours. She told herself these were only surface impressions. Surely when real challenges came, the humans would reveal their true nature, selfish, reckless, dangerous. But a small voice inside her whispered that perhaps she was wrong. The next day, she began observing the crew more closely. She watched the engineers at work. They did not move like machines, each obeying orders without thought, but instead they talked, discussed, even argued. And yet from the arguments came solutions, often faster and more creative than she had expected. They questioned each other, but not out of disobedience, out of care for the outcome. She found herself drawn to their way of solving problems, their willingness to consider ideas from anyone, regardless of rank. In her own world, such behavior would be unthinkable. Only those with high standing had the right to speak. But here, even the youngest cadet's suggestion could change the entire plan. Later, she saw something that unsettled her even more deeply. A crew member was injured during a routine check when a piece of machinery malfunctioned. She expected the humans to dismiss him, to continue their tasks while he was taken away. That was what her people would have done. Efficiency first, emotions later. But instead, she saw the entire team stop what they were doing. Others rushed to his side, calling for medical help, holding his hand, speaking words of comfort. The injured man winced in pain, but he smiled faintly because of the voices around him. Even the captain came, not as a distant authority figure, but as someone deeply concerned. "Stay with us. We've got you," he said. And the injured man squeezed his hand weakly. She watched this scene with wide eyes. Why did they stop everything for one person? Why did the captain himself kneel on the floor to speak to a crewman? In her society, the weak would have been quietly replaced. But here, weakness did not seem to reduce a person's value. It almost made them more important. The alien girl could not make sense of it, and yet she could not forget it either. That evening, she walked the corridors alone, thinking of the injured man's smile. She thought about the captain's hand, gripping his, about the crew's voices calling encouragement. Something stirred inside her chest, something she could not name. It was unfamiliar and uncomfortable, but also strangely warm. By the end of her first week aboard the human ship, she realized her expectations had already been shaken. She had come prepared to see only recklessness and selfishness. Instead, she saw a kind of energy she could not explain. Humans were not careful like her people. They were loud, emotional, unpredictable. But there was strength hidden inside that unpredictability. There was a bond between them, a trust so natural it seemed unbreakable. And though she tried to deny it, she felt herself being pulled toward it, curious and unsettled. She told herself it was only the beginning. Perhaps soon she would see their darker sides. Perhaps soon they would prove her right. But deep down, she already knew. Something inside her had begun to change, and she could not stop it. The days slowly turned into weeks, and the alien girl's eyes were opened again and again. She had stepped on the human ship expecting to see chaos, selfishness, and a lack of discipline. She thought her people's warnings would be proven true, that she would leave with proof that humans were dangerous and unworthy of trust. But instead of arrogance, she began to see something she had never expected, something that unsettled her heart and mind at the same time. It started in the mess. Hall again. She had avoided it at first, preferring to eat alone, but humans did not let others stay alone for long. One evening, a group of young officers called out to her, waving their hands and insisting she sit with them. Their voices were loud and cheerful, but not unkind. She hesitated, yet something in their smiles made it impossible to refuse. She sat down, and for the first few minutes, she said nothing. But as she watched them share their meals, passing plates across the table, offering her food without hesitation, she realized something very strange. They were not guarding their portions, not measuring who got more or less. They gave freely, as if the food belonged to everyone, as if hunger was not only one person's problem, but everyone's. She could not help but compare it to her own people. In her world, meals were quiet, calculated, each portion exact. To share freely would be considered childish, yet here, it seemed natural. And when she finally accepted a piece of fruit offered by a laughing crew member, she felt something loosen in her chest. For the first time, she wondered if maybe humans found joy in simply being together, but what shocked her even more happened during a training drill. The ship simulated a hull breach, alarms blaring, red lights flashing. She expected panic, confusion, perhaps even people fighting for their own survival. Instead, she saw the crew fall into action with calm speed. Commands were shouted, but not in fear, rather with determination. Humans rushed to their stations, some securing the breach, others checking on their teammates. What stunned her most was when one officer realized a crewman was missing in the smoke-filled corridor. Without hesitation, he ran back into danger to find him. The girl's heart almost stopped as she watched through the viewing panel. A moment later, he returned, coughing, but dragging the missing crewmate with him. The drill ended, the danger cleared, and everyone clapped the officer on the back. The rescued man smiled weakly, apologizing for slowing them down. To the alien girl's surprise, instead of scolding him, his team laughed and said, "Don't worry, we've got you." She stood frozen. In her culture, one mistake like that could bring shame, even punishment. But here, mistakes did not define a person. Loyalty did. The incident kept replaying in her head. She could not understand why the officer risked himself for another when the mission could have gone smoother without such delays. To her people, the efficiency of the group was always greater than the safety of the individual. But to humans, it seemed the safety of the individual was the heart of the group itself. A few days later, another scene deepened her confusion. She was walking past the medical bay when she heard voices. Peering inside, she saw the ship's doctor working tirelessly on a man who had injured his hand badly. Several crew members stood around, offering encouragement, not leaving until the treatment was done. One even joked to lighten the mood, making the patient laugh despite his pain. The alien girl leaned against the wall, watching silently. She thought of her people, who would have simply let the medics handle it, who would never waste time standing beside an injured person unless it was family. But here, everyone acted like family. She began asking questions, though carefully. She did not want to show how shaken she was, so she asked with a tone of curiosity. One evening, sitting with a human officer in the observation lounge, she asked why the crew always seemed to stop everything for one person. He looked at her, puzzled at first, then smiled. "Because every life matters," he said simply. "If one of us is hurt, all of us feel it. We don't leave people behind." The simplicity of his words struck her more than any complicated philosophy could. In her society, such thinking would be considered weak, even dangerous. And yet, looking at him, at his steady eyes and calm voice, she realized he did not think of it as weakness at all. To him, it was strength. She remembered how her elders always warned her that humans were ruled by their emotions. Now she began to see the truth in that. But it was not the truth she had been told. Their emotions did not weaken them. They gave them a kind of courage she had never known. Another moment carved itself into her memory. A celebration was held for a successful mission. She thought they would boast or gloat over their victory, but instead they gathered quietly first. They raised their glasses and spoke the names of those who had fallen in past battles, honoring them with silence and respect. She felt her throat tighten as she watched. They did not hide their grief. They carried it openly, but with pride, as if remembering the fallen gave meaning to their survival. When they finally began to laugh and celebrate, it was not arrogance, but gratitude for life, for each other, for the chance to keep going. For the alien girl, it was almost unbearable. She had been raised to see death as something to forget, quickly, to cover with silence. But here, death was carried with honor as part of the living. She did not know how to process it. Slowly, without realizing, she found herself drawn closer to them. One night in the mess hall, a story was being told at her table. The humans laughed so hard that one of them spilled his drink. Instead of pulling away in disgust, she felt a sudden laugh escape her own lips. The sound surprised her. She had not laughed like that since childhood. The humans turned to her, grinning widely, and for the first time she felt included, as though the warmth of their circle had opened just enough for her to step inside. That night she lay awake again, staring at the ceiling of her quarters. She told herself she must be careful. She must not lose herself in their ways. Yet her heart whispered something else. Perhaps there was something to be learned here, something her people had missed. By the end of the second part of her journey, the alien girl realized that her view of humans was no longer the same. They were not perfect. They were loud, clumsy, emotional, and sometimes foolish. But beneath it all, she saw a force she could not deny. A deep, unshakable loyalty to each other, a belief that no one should stand alone. And though she wanted to resist it, she knew it was already changing her. The more she saw, the harder. It became to imagine going back to the cold order of her own people without carrying a piece of this strange human fire inside her. The alien girl's heart had already started to shift, though she tried to deny it. She told herself she was still only observing, still only studying these strange humans. But the truth was different. Every day she spent among them, every moment. She watched their behavior. Something new sparked inside her. She was beginning to see them not as subjects to be studied, but as people with lives, with laughter, with pain, and with something powerful holding them together. It was one evening, after a long day of training, that she found herself standing in the observation lounge again. The stars stretched endlessly across the glass, but her attention was not on the sky. A human officer joined her, one she had seen often, but never spoken to at length. He offered her a drink, not alcohol, but something warm and sweet, and sat beside her without ceremony. For a moment they sat in silence, only the hum of the ship around them. Then she asked the question that had been troubling her since she arrived. Why did humans act the way they did? So open, so emotional, so quick, to risk themselves for others? The officer chuckled softly before answering. He explained that humans had survived because of each other, not in spite of each other. "We aren't the strongest species out there," he said. "We don't have claws or armor or the fastest ships. But what we have is each other. That's our strength. When we stand together, nothing can break us." His words were simple, yet they struck her like thunder. She had always been taught that strength meant independence, never needing anyone, proving yourself above others. But here was a man telling her strength came from unity, from bonds, from caring about more than yourself. The conversation stayed, with her long after he left. She could not stop thinking about his calm face, his quiet conviction. Could it really be that what her people saw as weakness was, in fact, humanity's greatest power? Her chance to test this new thought came sooner than she expected. One night, the crew gathered in the mess hall for a small celebration. It was nothing grand, just a successful run through dangerous space with no damage. Yet the humans treated it as a victory worth honoring. They decorated the tables, played music, and laughed louder than she had ever heard. At first, she stood off to the side as she always did, but then one of the officers spotted her and waved her over. "Come on, don't stand there alone. Join us." She hesitated, but finally walked closer. They made space for her at the table as though she had always belonged there. Food was passed around, stories told, voices overlapping in cheerful noise. She tried to remain still to observe, but their joy was contagious. Then one of the humans stood and raised a glass. The room grew quiet. He began to speak, not of their victory, but of the struggles behind it. He remembered friends they had, lost on other journeys, spoke their names with respect, and thanked them for paving the way. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It was full of memory and meaning. The alien girl felt a lump in her throat. She had never seen people honor the dead like this. In her world, death was pushed aside, unspoken, something to forget, quickly so it would not weaken the living. But here death was carried openly, shared among them, turned into a bond that made them stronger instead of weaker. When the toast ended, the laughter returned, but now she saw it differently. They did not laugh because they ignored pain. They laughed because they had faced it together and chosen life anyway. She found herself smiling softly, almost without realizing. Then someone told a joke, and before she could stop herself, she laughed out loud. The humans looked at her with delight, happy to see her join in, and for the first time she did not feel like an outsider. She felt like she was part of something bigger, something warm and alive. The change in her was small but undeniable. She began spending more time with them, asking more questions, listening to their stories. She learned about their homes, their families, their dreams. They spoke of Earth with shining eyes, describing oceans, forests, cities filled with life. They told her about music, about art, about traditions that seemed so simple but carried deep meaning. One officer even played her a song on a small instrument, and she sat silently, amazed that sound alone could carry so much feeling. As days turned into weeks, she realized she was no longer only observing, she was experiencing. She was learning, not from books or lessons, but from being among them. She felt herself laughing more easily, speaking more openly, even letting herself share small pieces of her own past. And when she did, the humans listened, with genuine interest, never mocking, never dismissing her. It felt strange, almost dangerous, to be so open, but it also felt right. The moment that sealed her growing bond came late one evening. She was walking back to her quarters when she heard voices in one of the maintenance bays. Curious, she stepped inside. There she saw a group of engineers gathered around a broken machine. They were tired, their faces smudged with grease, but instead of arguing harshly, they teased each other, joked, even sang while they worked. One of them noticed her and waved her over. Without thinking, she joined them. At first, she only watched, but then they asked her opinion. Shocked, she gave a small suggestion. To her surprise, they considered it seriously, then tried it. When it worked, they cheered and clapped her on the shoulder as though she had saved the day. Her chest tightened with a feeling she could not describe. In her world, she would never have been allowed to speak in such a situation unless she had the highest authority. Here, her voice mattered simply because she was present. It was overwhelming. For the first time, she felt useful among them. Not just as an observer, but as part of the crew. That night, she lay awake, her thoughts racing. Everything she had been taught about humans was being broken piece by piece. They were not selfish. They were not careless. They were not weak because of their emotions. If anything, their emotions were the very reason they were strong. They cared for each other in a way she had never imagined possible, and that care made them brave, made them powerful. She realized something else, too. She was changing. She no longer saw them with cold detachment. She laughed with them, worried for them, even admired them. She was forming bonds she had never meant to create. And though it frightened her, it also filled her with a strange joy she had never known before. By the end of this stage of her journey, the alien girl knew she could no longer see humans as she once had. They were not perfect, but they carried something within them that her people lacked. Something that made her wonder if she could ever truly return to her old life unchanged. For the first time, she looked at the humans not as subjects of study, but as friends. And that realization alone was enough to change the path of her life forever. The alien girl had grown used to the rhythm of the human ship. She no longer stood in the shadows at mealtimes, no longer avoided the noise of their celebrations. She had even laughed with them, worked with them, and shared moments she never imagined she would. But she had not yet seen what they were like in true danger. In her heart, she still believed that when real threats came, the humans would reveal the recklessness her people always warned about. She thought they would break under pressure or show selfishness when survival was at stake. That belief was shattered the day the enemy came. It began quietly. The ship was moving through a stretch of empty space when the alarms suddenly blared. Red lights flashed, voices filled the halls, and the calm hum of the ship turned into the sharp sound of alert. The alien girl felt her chest tighten as she hurried to the observation deck, where she could see the view screen. Dark shapes appeared out of the void. Enemy ships, fast and armed. The humans had been ambushed. She expected panic. She expected shouting, chaos, and people running for their own safety. Instead, she saw the crew spring into action with astonishing focus. Orders were shouted, yes, but with clarity, not fear. Each person ran to their station, hands steady, eyes sharp. The captain's voice cut through the alarms, strong and controlled. Shields up! Prepare for evasive maneuvers. All stations, report. The alien girl stood frozen, her heart pounding. These humans, who only hours ago were laughing over food and jokes, now moved like steel forged in fire. The first blast rocked the ship. Sparks flew, the floor trembled, and she grabbed onto the railing. Her people would have immediately calculated losses, prepared to retreat, or abandoned weaker sections of the ship. But the humans did not even hesitate. Engineers rushed to contain the damage. Medics ran toward the injured without waiting for orders. Security officers took up positions, their faces calm despite the danger. Then, something happened that shook her even more deeply. A section of the engineering bay was hit, fire breaking out, systems failing. Through the smoke, she saw a young human engineer struggling to repair the failing circuits. The captain called for him to withdraw, but the engineer shouted back, "If I leave, the shields will drop." Without hesitation, he stayed in the flames, working desperately. The alien girl's breath caught. He was risking his life not for himself, but for everyone else. His voice echoed in her ears, "If I leave, the shields will drop." She had never seen such a thing in her world. The battle raged on. The ship shuddered under the weight of enemy fire, but the humans did not waver. Every officer, every crew member, fought not just for survival, but for each other. She watched as one officer shielded another from falling debris, taking the injury himself. She saw medics carrying wounded through smoke-filled corridors, refusing to abandon them even when alarms screamed that oxygen levels were dropping. Her people would have cut their losses, leaving behind those who slowed the mission. But humans seemed incapable of leaving anyone behind. For the first time, the alien girl herself acted. She saw a panel sparking dangerously near a group of humans trying to reroute power. Without thinking, she rushed forward, using her knowledge of her own technology to stabilize the system. The humans turned to her with surprise, then gratitude. In that moment, she felt something powerful. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of the fight. The enemy pressed harder, and the ship groaned under the assault. Yet even as damage spread, the humans did not break. The captain's voice remained steady, guiding his people, refusing to give in. "Hold the line," he commanded. "We stand together." Those words carried through the ship like fire through dry grass, filling every person with determination. The alien girl felt it too, a surge of strength that was not hers alone but theirs, shared and multiplied. At one point, an explosion cut power to a corridor near her. Smoke poured in, and she saw a human officer struggling to reach a trapped crewman. The alien girl hesitated only for a second before joining him. Together, they pulled the injured man free, coughing and stumbling into safety. The officer looked at her, his eyes shining despite the chaos. "You're one of us now," he said simply, before rushing back into the fight. Her chest tightened at those words. One of us. She had never been one of anything before, not truly. Hours. Felt like days, but slowly, the tide turned. The humans, with their stubborn resilience, held their ground. They worked together as though their lives were threads in the same fabric, and no thread would be cut without all of them fighting to save it. Finally, with a final coordinated strike, they forced the enemy ships to retreat. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of alarms fading and exhausted breaths echoing through the corridors. The alien girl stood among them, covered in smoke and dust, her body trembling. She had seen courage before in stories of warriors from her own people, but never like this. This was not the courage of one individual proving their strength. This was the courage of many hearts beating as one, each person willing to give everything for the others. When the fires were put out and the injured carried to the medical bay, she walked the corridors in a daze. Everywhere she looked, she saw humans leaning on each other, smiling despite their exhaustion, hugging those who had survived. She saw the captain clasp hands with the young engineer who had stayed in the fire, his face filled with pride and relief. And she realized something deep within her. She had been wrong about humans from the beginning. They were not reckless. They were not selfish. They were not weak. They were stronger than she had ever imagined, not because they ignored fear, but because they faced it together. Their strength was not in their weapons or their ships. It was in their unity, in the way they refused to let anyone stand alone. As she sat quietly in the mess hall later, surrounded by tired but smiling faces, she felt tears sting her eyes. She had helped them. She had risked herself, not because she was ordered to, but because she wanted to. And in return, they had accepted her as one of them without hesitation. It was a feeling she had never known before, and it shook her to her very core. That night, lying in her quarters, she whispered to herself words she never thought she would say. "I belong here." The thought scared her, but it also filled her with a quiet joy. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be part of something greater than herself. And she knew she could never go back to the way she had been before. The battle had ended, but its echo stayed inside her heart. The alien girl walked through the human ship in the days that followed, seeing everything differently. Where once she saw noise and chaos, now she saw life. Where once she saw disorder, now she saw unity. Where once she saw weakness in their emotions, now she saw strength more powerful than any weapon. She had not only watched them fight, she had fought beside them, and that had changed her forever. She spent hours in the medical bay, helping in small ways while the injured were treated. She saw the captain himself, visiting every wounded crew member, speaking to them not as a distant leader, but as someone who cared deeply. He asked about their pain, thanked them for their courage, and made sure none of them felt forgotten. To her people, leaders never lowered themselves to speak to the injured. Leaders stayed distant, untouchable. But here, leadership meant sharing both the danger and the healing. She realized that was why the crew trusted him so completely, because he stood with them, not above them. One evening, she walked into the mess hall and found it full again. The crew was gathered, but not for celebration this time. It was a quiet gathering. They spoke the names of those who had fallen, lighting small candles and placing them on the tables. She sat among them, silent, listening as each story was shared. Memories of bravery, moments of friendship, jokes that would never be told again. Some people cried openly, others sat in quiet sorrow, but no one was alone in their grief. The alien girl felt her chest ache. She had never been part of such a ritual. In her world, grief was private, almost shameful. But here, grief was shared. It was carried together, so no one bore it alone. As she listened, she remembered the young engineer who had stayed in the flames to keep the shields up. He had survived, barely, and was still healing. She thought of how close he had come to dying for the sake of others. She thought of how many others would have been lost if not for his choice. And for the first time, she asked herself a question that shook her soul. If she were in his place, would she have done the same? The answer came to her slowly, but it came with certainty. Yes. After what she had seen, she knew she would. The realization frightened her, but it also gave her a strange sense of peace. Her days on the human ship continued, but they were no longer the same. She was no longer only an observer. She worked with the crew, ate with them, laughed with them. They taught her small things: how to play their games, how to sing their songs, how to tell stories around the table. She taught them things too, sharing pieces of her own culture, her language, her traditions. They listened with interest, never mocking, never dismissing. For the first time in her life, she felt like her voice mattered, not because of her rank or her family, but simply because she was herself. One night, sitting alone in her quarters, she looked at her reflection. She barely recognized the person she had become. She had arrived with suspicion, carrying the weight of her people's warnings. She had thought humans were reckless, selfish, and weak, but now she saw the truth. They were reckless, yes, but that recklessness came from courage. They were emotional, yes, but those emotions gave them strength. They were flawed, but it was those flaws that made them real, that made them strong in ways her people could not understand. She thought about returning home. What would she say to her elders, to those who had warned her? Could she tell them the truth? That humans were not to be feared but to be learned from? That their strength came not from cold calculation, but from warmth, from love, from bonds that could not be broken? She knew they would not believe her easily. They would say she had been tricked, that she had been blinded. But she also knew she could not stay silent. The truth burned too brightly inside her. The decision came to her slowly, like the rising of a sun. She would carry this truth home. She would tell her people what she had seen, what she had lived. She would tell them that humans were not enemies, not fools, but something different, something powerful because of the very things her people had always dismissed. And even if they did not believe her, she would not stop. She had seen it with her own eyes. She had felt it in her own heart. On her final day aboard, the crew gathered to say farewell. They gave her a gift, a small object she had seen on the captain's desk, a simple stone carved with words in the human tongue. "We stand together." She held it in her hand, feeling the weight of it, the meaning pressed into its rough surface. Her throat tightened, and for the first time, she allowed her tears to fall in front of them. No one mocked her. No one turned away. They simply smiled and embraced her, welcoming her tears as part of their own. As she stepped off the ship and walked back into the docking bay of her home station, she knew she was not the same girl who had left. The station looked colder, emptier, more silent than ever before. She carried the human stone in her hand, her heart heavy with the weight of what she must do. She knew her path would be difficult. She knew her people would resist. but she also knew she could not turn back. The alien girl, once so certain of human weakness, now carried a truth that had changed her forever. She had seen bravery born of love, strength born of unity, hope carried through grief. She had lived among humans and found not danger, but family. And she knew with unshakable certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. She whispered softly to herself as she looked back at the human ship one last time. They were right. They do stand together, and now, so do I.